A quick welcome on behalf of Europe House and the European Parliament. My name is Gergely Polner, working here in communications at Europe House. I'd like to thank our speakers tonight, Lord Hannay and John Peet, for the availability and their time. We'll start with a short presentation by Lord Hannay, and then John Peet is going to ask questions and discuss the UK's 40 years in the EU and the EEC.
Shall I just kick off by introducing David? I'm sure most of you know who he is, and we're here to celebrate his book, Britain's Quest for a Role. It ranges well beyond the EU. It begins in Afghanistan, in fact, and then there are episodes in Washington, New York at the UN, and Cyprus at a later stage. And indeed, David has written a book on Cyprus, so for those of you who want to understand the Cyprus problem and why it's been so difficult to solve, you should look at that book as well. The timing of this event could not be better. When we first scheduled it, it was going to be one day before the Berlin speech. Then later it was going to be 3 days after the Amsterdam speech. And I believe now it's going to be 2 days before the London speech. So the whole subject of Britain and Europe, which is the constant theme, I think, of David's book, is highly topical. Yes, I will ask maybe one or two questions and then throw it open to the floor. But first of all, David's going to talk for about 15-20 minutes.
Right, thank you, John, and thank you to the European Parliament Office for having arranged what I think is a very well-timed occasion, all the better timed due to the Prime Minister's misfortunes on the timing of his speech, because I didn't actually much fancy doing it the day after, or I didn't much fancy at all doing it the same day, because I have a strong objection to commenting on people's speeches when I haven't read them, and I didn't really much fancy doing it the day after. So I've avoided all those matters, those traps, even if the Prime Minister fell into one or two of his own making. But the purpose of what I'm doing this evening is to, drawing on, mainly on material in my book, but I promise you I'm not about to work my way through all the way from Tehran and Kabul to New York and Nicosia, was to look at one or two of the episodes in the early years of Britain's membership, which I think have some lessons for us in the present time, and just sort of examine them. First, how they worked out in 74-75, the renegotiation followed by the referendum, and then in the 1980s, the budget battles over the British rebate and the Delors package in 1987-88. And those four sets of events seem to me to be all worth looking at. But of course, if you're trying to do something, which I'm doing now, which is to look at them from the perspective of somebody who lived through them, but then also to see whether you can draw any lessons from them or thoughts from them, you do have to avoid two basic pitfalls. One is to give the impression, or to believe yourself, that history repeats itself exactly, and to say, well, this is what happened then, and this will now therefore happen now. That clearly is untrue. It doesn't happen like that. But the other pitfall is to think that what happened then, because it was 40 years ago, and memories of the events then are pretty vague probably in most people's minds, to think, well, we don't need to know about that. That's just, that's then, and now is now. Which, of course, in the world of 24/7 media and so on, is all too easy to slip into that. So I will try and steer between Scylla and Charybdis in that respect. Now let's start with what the British called renegotiation in 1974, but nobody else did. It was a banned word. I was, at the time, working in the Commission. I was the chef de cabinet to the senior British Commissioner, Christopher Soames, and the word renegotiation, I'm pretty sure, when the Commission's archives come to be opened up, will not appear there. Anyway, not often. So my vantage point was that of somebody working in the Commission. I had no access whatsoever to British policy making at that time, other than what various manipulative British diplomats might choose to communicate to me, or what my boss Christopher Soames might pick up on his frequent visits to London. And if you want to know about how British policy was formulated, then you must pick up the brilliant book that Stephen Wall has brought out this year, which is the official history of British policy towards Europe in that period that stretches from 1974, I think I'm right in saying, onwards for about 10 years. He's now writing another volume which will take it on beyond there, and that may be even more fascinating. But it is very good, and if you want to know how British policy was formulated, what Harold Wilson was trying to do, what Margaret Thatcher was trying to do, how the referendum campaign impacted and all that, that's where you want to go. I start looking at the renegotiation at the moment it really began in community terms. Not, of course, in British political terms, because in British political terms it began with the drafting, with the great rows in the Labour Party, which John Roper over there is very familiar with, and the Labour manifesto for the 1974 election, which had renegotiation embedded within it. Although nobody in Brussels took it terribly seriously ahead of the election, because A, they didn't know what it meant, and the manifesto certainly didn't enlighten you on that point, and B, they didn't think the Labour Party was going to win the election. So they were wrong on both points, but after the election we were rapidly brought to realise that this was a serious business, and the key opening salvo was fired by James Callaghan, Foreign Secretary, who came to Luxembourg to the council meeting in Luxembourg at the beginning of April and gave a very hardline presentation which really did blow people's socks off. It would have been much more, the impact would have been much stronger if it hadn't been that President Pompidou died that day. And so the whole events in Luxembourg were overshadowed by the death of Pompidou, which of course meant there had to be a French presidential election immediately within however many days it is afterwards. So that rather overshadowed Callaghan's salvo, which he unleashed then. But there was a great deal of shock and horror at what was being said, and at the fairly brutal way it was presented on that occasion. The brutality, you will not be surprised to know, being entirely directed, of course, to the serried ranks of Eurosceptic Labour Party members of Parliament, not to the people who were listening to it. But that didn't mean that it wasn't negative. And the reaction was not negative, it was pretty negative. And at that point, or very shortly after that point, and that may be in the Commission archives or it may not, I don't know, I wrote a paper for the two British commissioners which I entitled Renegotiation Without Tears, drawn from a title which some of you may recognise of a book called French Without Tears. And the paper I wrote for them, which they then shared with their colleagues in the Commission, and which really became more or less the basis of Commission policy towards renegotiation, consisted of three main elements. The first was that the Commission should keep a very low profile and should avoid a great semantic battle about the word renegotiation, should avoid lecturing everyone to explain how it couldn't be right and it was breaking treaty obligations, etc., etc. And should be prepared, the Commission, I argued, and they accepted this, to allow the British government of the day to label as renegotiation anything they wanted to. Things that happened in the normal run of a European business, they could say what they liked about it, and they did in the white paper that they subsequently published, and which was the basis for the referendum thereafter. But we shouldn't contradict them or say, but that's wrong, it's not renegotiation, or anything like that. The second was that the Commission should avoid at all costs becoming the intermediary between the Commission, between the British and the Member States, but should leave the British government of the day to deal on its own directly with the Member States, and should concentrate on providing the other members than Britain, and indeed the British too, with technical advice and support for whatever was attempted to be negotiated. And that was the pattern that was followed. So the Commission never made any proposals during the renegotiation period. In Brussels terms, it never put proposals on the table. It just facilitated a series of discussions between the Member States, the 9 Member States as they were then, and came forward with bits of paper as necessary, but they were not Commission proposals. And the third one was, which is very much like the first one, was that the Commission should avoid making a lot of public statements about what was going on, and should avoid, as I say, locking horns at Commissioner level over whether or not it was reasonable to be doing what the British government of the day asked its partners to do, to renegotiate. Now, the proceedings went on for nearly a year, and they were actually reasonably free of drama and great upset. And why was that so? Very simple. Because at a very early stage in the proceedings, once the new incoming Labour government had actually discussed it all amongst itself, the British Permanent Representative, Michael Palliser, alas, died last year. The British Permanent Representative told his colleagues that there was a clear decision in London that we were not going to propose any changes to the basic treaties or any changes to the Treaty of Accession. So that we were not going to propose anything that required ratification or anything that challenged the view that pacta sunt servanda and what had been agreed in the accession negotiations was Holy Writ. And that, of course, immediately changed the atmosphere fundamentally. Now, what came out of those negotiations? Well, I think most historians would say not a lot. There was a mechanism for dealing with the British excessive budgetary contribution, but it was not a terribly well thought out one, because it only dealt with the revenue side, that's to say the disproportionate but not hugely disproportionate amount that Britain paid into the budget because of the pattern of our trade being more with countries outside the European Union than the other members, and it didn't do anything at all about the expenditure side, which is where the real problem was, the huge disproportion of the budget going on agriculture and the small-ish size of the British agriculture, so they didn't get much back. So that mechanism was not, it was fiendishly complicated too, and when the budget crisis finally broke in 1979-1980, it proved to be inoperable. So that wasn't a huge success, but it looked as if it looked a bit better at the time in 1975 than it did afterwards. And then there was a negotiation on the amounts of New Zealand butter that could be imported into Britain after the end of the transitional period. It wasn't actually essential to do that then. There were provisions in the Treaty of Accession to do it later, but everyone was prepared to bring that forward and to agree a pretty generous settlement. So, like in the accession negotiations, the New Zealanders did pretty well out of this, and they got several more years of highish tonnages of butter imports to Britain. They didn't go to the rest of Europe. And then there was a mass of stuff which came under the category that I've described as normal European business, but which, in the white paper, the British government chose to call renegotiation. So that was really the story of the renegotiation as seen from Brussels. Now, what parallels can we see in that for the present day? Well, I think there are quite a lot, actually. First of all, the issue was always seen by everyone around Europe as being about the politics of the Labour Party. It wasn't seriously about anything wider than that. Just as now, the fundamental background we're working is the politics of the Conservative Party. That's the only thing that's changed, really. But there is a great similarity in that. Now, you can see, if you look around now, certain items of normal European business which may well be presentable to the British public as being something that is very good and in our interest as well as in the interests of the EU as a whole. Perhaps if there is a transatlantic trade deal, perhaps if there's a free trade area with Japan, perhaps if the common fisheries policy is changed rather fundamentally, as is beginning to emerge in Brussels now, with greater powers to the regions, the fishery regions, and less decisions being taken in the centre. So that could well fill out a sequel to a renegotiation without tears, which could be called repatriation without tears. I don't know whether it will happen or not, but I just say that that is a possibility. Now, the general atmosphere throughout renegotiation was, as I say, pretty good. There weren't many dramas, and I have to say very clearly that this is where there is not a parallel with the present time. There was a great deal of understanding of the fact that several bits of the accession negotiations had left the UK with a pretty poor deal, and that some, and the budget and New Zealand were among them, and that something could be done, particularly if the UK was not trying to change the treaties. That aspect is different, I believe, now. I think the atmosphere is a lot less propitious than it was then. There's, of course, a lot of history behind that, which I will not go into. But I don't think we should think that that the response to a British position, which is now not likely to be put on a table as opposed to finding its place in a prime ministerial speech, until after the 2015 election, and then only if the Conservative government gets an overall majority. I think we should beware of thinking that it will all go as easily and that repatriation without tears will be just a rerun of renegotiation without tears. Enough for renegotiation. Then the referendum of 75, again, I was viewing it from the vantage point of the Commission. We had an absolute rule in the Commission that no non-British commissioner was to cross the Channel during the referendum campaign. It was seen to be completely counterproductive. The only one who did was Guido Brunner, who disobeyed all the agreements of his colleagues, but I'm afraid to say he was a person who didn't figure much on anyone's radar, and so he came and went without anyone really noticing it. But it was wise advice, and I think that that will be true again if we ever get into a referendum situation. I think that it will be true that external involvement in the campaign is not likely to be positive, and I would only make one exception to that, which has already been made by President Obama, who comes, I think, in a completely different category, who has expressed his views quite clearly, both through his Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Phil Gordon, who was here 10 days ago, and himself in a telephone call to the Prime Minister. And what he has done is not to interfere in a British process, but just to draw to the attention of the British public and the British government that the United States administration, now about to set off for another 4-year mandate, does not want Britain to leave the European Union, and to make it clear that the so-called transatlantic alternative, which some of the Eurosceptics like to talk about, the alternative of a Britain outside the European Union having a wonderful relationship with the United States, is not on offer. And that is pretty important, and I think will continue to be so. Now, looking at the referendum campaign, as I say, the Commission kept right out of it. The only involvement we had was that there were rafts of parliamentary questions put down by British members of the European Parliament, which the Commission answered very fully in ways which enabled the press to kill off some of the Euro myths of the day. And that was, I think, pretty valuable, and it was something the British government couldn't do itself, but which the Commission could do, and it was entirely proper to do, because these were questions put down by European members, British members of the European Parliament. Now, looking at the referendum outcome itself, and asking the question again, if there were parallels, if we ever get to a kind of in-out referendum, because of course the 75 referendum was an in-out referendum, although the question was, do you approve the terms negotiated by Britain in the renegotiation? It was well understood that if the answer had been no, we would have had to leave the European community. There was never any doubt really about that, serious doubt about that. So it was an in-out referendum. But the most important thing about it is that it didn't settle anything. And that was absolutely clear beyond peradventure within weeks, or perhaps months, of the referendum. 2/3 majority voted to stay in. Within a few months, Tony Benn, John Silkin, Peter Shaw were out there trying to get the Labour government of the day to pursue policies which were effectively blocking things that were happening in Brussels. And within 6 years, they had got a Labour Party manifesto for the 1983 election, which actually committed the Labour Party, if it had won, Mrs. Thatcher actually won a 140-seat majority, so we never know what would have happened, to leave the European community. So anybody who says that a referendum in 2018 will settle this for good is, I'm afraid, deluding themselves. And if you want to see why I would think that, just look at the language and attitude of the Europhobes and what they say. Do you think that they're going to have an epiphany on the day after a majority votes to stay in? No, of course they're not. They're just going to start all over again. That's the reality. So it is not true. I mean, I have a lot of other objections to referendums, which I will not bore with you tonight, which I think amount to a principled view on referendums, although Charlie Faulkner described it as a rant when I last unleashed it on the House of Lords. But I shall not bother you with that tonight. But that point I am absolutely clear about. It will not settle the issue. So people who say we need it to clear the air, to settle it once and for all that is a false prospectus. Now, move on then to the budgets. First of all, the great budget battles that started in 1979 when the British transitional provisions in the accession treaty ran out and we became subject to the full application of the budget rules which had been negotiated just before we opened our accession negotiations were settled in 1970. That was a huge business. It lasted for a long, long time. Mrs. Thatcher was, of course, enormously prominent in it, and nobody in the other member states disputed that the case that we had raised, which we had raised in the accession negotiations when we had tabled a large number of predictions as to how the European budget would impact on us at the end of the transitional period, but which was dismissed by the Commission and the other member states as being exaggerated, too pessimistic, etc. Well, actually, we proved pretty well right, and the dismissals proved wrong. But at that time, as you probably know, the the six said to us, but if a situation arises such as you described, the survival of the European community itself will depend on finding an equitable solution. So nobody at that stage disputed that there was a problem, because the figures were horrendous in 1980. They were enormous. And the 5 years that then followed, alas, were a row about two sets of things. One, of course, was about the quantum and the nature of the settlement, and the other was about religion, which was whether or not you were allowed to talk about a net contribution, or whether talking about a net contribution was what people in Brussels called the juste retour. That prolonged things for a very long time. It was a horrible negotiation. It was, by definition, Britain against the rest, because every adjustment that was made to the British budget contribution had to be paid for by the others. And so it was a zero-sum negotiation, the worst kind of all. You always hope to be in a negotiation in which the cake gets bigger and everyone can get a slice of it. But this was not like that, which is why it lasted a long time. A lot of hard words were spoken by Mrs. Thatcher and by the other member states. And eventually the Fontainebleau mechanism was agreed. I don't think there are very many parallels with present budget situations. I don't think there's many lessons to be drawn from that, other than that budget negotiations are horrible, and there's no way of making them less horrible, not really. But what I would say was that the Commission's proposal last year really did shock me considerably, because the first phase of the negotiations that Mrs. Thatcher was involved in led in 1980, or was it 81, 80, to a lump sum settlement for the 5 years. And during those 5 years, we all came to learn that a lump sum settlement was completely absurd, because you didn't know what either the input or the output of the budget was going to be. So you had 2 years, in fact, in 80 and 81, when Britain got back far too much, virtually didn't have a net contribution at all, and 3 years after that when it got back far too little. So nobody disputed at the end of that process that a lump sum approach was completely useless. And yet the Commission proposed one last year. So, well, that has got nowhere, and I have to tell you, will not get anywhere, because it is a hopeless approach. And then we got the system that exists now, the 2/3 net contribution rebated, but of course the amount of the community expenditure to which it applies has changed over time. It changed quite markedly when the big enlargement took place in 2004, because a lot of the expenditure in the new member states was taken out of the calculation of the rebate. And the result of that is that the British net contribution in 2012, I think it is, or perhaps it's 2013, is going to be somewhere in the region of 9 billion euros. Not noticeably close to something called the juste retour, although I'm sorry to say the Director General of the Budget of the Commission actually called it that to the EU Select Committee last year, to which did cause some eyebrows to be raised. So I don't think there are any very obvious parallels. The European Union community was up against the revenue ceiling, and there was real concern amongst many countries, not Britain only, that if they hit the ceiling and nothing had been done, disaster would befall. But of course that situation does not exist now, because the ceiling that was set in 1988, which is the last time it was moved, is now way above the European budget, which is hovering around, is going to hover around 1%. And the ceiling is 1.24, I think, or 1.27. I can't remember. They've changed it from GNP to GNI, and it's, anyway, as you can see, it's a way above being a constraint in any sort of way now, or a threat to people who are large net beneficiaries. So that force which really helped people come to a decision in the 1980s doesn't exist. And then finally, of the fourth things, the Delors package. I put that in because that was the second of the big budget negotiations in the 1980s. Because it was very close to being the situation we're in now. It wasn't called the multi-annual financial framework, but it was effectively that. It was the first one, although the first one to be called that was in the 1990s. But it was effectively that, i.e. the negotiators looked at the overall pattern of European expenditure, of which the rebate was only one part, and decided roughly how much was going to be allocated to agriculture, to the structural funds, to research and innovation, and so on. So it's very like the present situation. That followed a pattern very close to the pattern of the last year. That's to say, there were 2 unsuccessful attempts to reach agreement, and a third successful attempt to reach an agreement. It was again a pretty nasty negotiation, but it worked out, and Helmut Kohl chaired the Key Council in February 1988, so perhaps in February 2013 we will find that Mr. Van Rompuy will repeat that piece of successful alchemy. We will see, but the way in which the differences were gradually narrowed down does have certain similarities. The other thing that was very noticeable about that negotiation is, and I apologise for that in this building which belongs to the European Commission, the Commission loses control over a budget negotiation as the process goes on. Why? Because in the eyes of the Member States, the Commission is a spending department, and they are the Treasury. So the Member States treat the Commission like the Treasury treats spending departments in this country. And I don't need to tell you that that is not a nice spectacle. And I needn't tell you also as to who wins in purely negotiating terms, not in substantive terms, because often the outcome, as perhaps we are seeing now, is not always very equitable or very acceptable to everyone. But that's the way that goes. And so we are now in the last phase of that. I noticed that there's a certain amount in the press of optimism about the February meeting. I hope myself that it will succeed. The British have so far managed to avoid being isolated, which is very necessary, because the only way you can handle the big negotiation like the multi-annual financial framework is to have a group of countries who more or less see the same way. We had that in 1988. It was the British, the Netherlands and Germany who believed that the agricultural spending should be cut back and who believed that the overall total should be more constrained than the other member states did. And the outcome was a success. As I say, you've heard, so successful that the revenue ceiling is still in existence and is likely to be for a very, very, very long time, because I cannot see the circumstances in which raising that 1.25% revenue ceiling will exist. And we're miles short of it now, with hovering around the 1%. So I think there is quite a lot to be learned from that negotiation, and I hope that all concerned will learn that. Some of the lessons are not very attractive. For instance, that when you are conducting the final stages negotiation, there is, alas, a tendency to cut the things that would be most useful to have in the budget and to retain the things which people, the sacred cows that people are not prepared to slaughter. So I fear that the outcome, if it is successful in February, will not be a brilliant one, and I'm not going to get into the business of what the figure will be, except that it will be somewhere, I would suggest, between what was on the table last November and the position of the budget austerity group, who call themselves something different in a piece of oral speak, which I can't now recall, but something like the Group for Better Spending in Europe, or something like that. It'll be somewhere between those two. It may not bear a very close relationship to the vote in the House of Commons, which took place in rather different circumstances in October, but it won't be that far away either, I don't think. But of course, it may not succeed. It may not, because, as I said at the very beginning, historic parallels are never exact. So there I will stop, because I hope that I've given you a bit of food for thought there, and John and I, and the rest of you, I hope, can now carry on this discussion from a sedentary position.